folks, and welcome to Tuesday Teaching Tips. This is episode number 230, and we're now today picking up again on a series I began last year, and this is the fifth in this series for last year, the fifth today, and they're all from this book called The Heart of Communication, subtitle How to Really Connect with an Audience by Rob Parsons. Terrific little book on public speaking, both in a secular and spiritual context, if we can use those designations in any meaningful way. But I think you'll like this episode today, I hope so, all about stories. He has this quote at the beginning of the chapter by a quote from Roy Peter Clark. Reports convey information. Stories create experience. Reports transfer knowledge. Stories transport the reader, crossing boundaries of time and space and imagination. The report points us there. The story puts us there. I like that. Really true, isn't it? Such a big difference between just a factual account of something and then a story. You probably don't need me or Rob Parsons to convince you of the significance of stories, either in the experiencing of them for yourself or in the telling of them. But perhaps we need a bit more convincing to work at it, to make it a core part of our teaching and preaching. Stories are fundamental to the human condition. And one other person quoted in the book is said to have said, "The universe is made of stories, not atoms." I rather like that. The universe is made of stories, not atoms. Well, yes, it's made of atoms, but what would human experience be without story? You might like to read, by the way, another book called The Storyteller's Secret, which is not a religious or Christian book, but I found it very useful to dip into. I haven't read the whole book. That'll have to be for a future episode. But The Storyteller's Secret, which is by, who is it by? I've lost the name here. Yes, that's it. Carmine Gallo. Carmine Gallo. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. But it's a really good book about how to tell stories and why they're important. And they have a quote in the book. "Show me an inspiring leader and I'll show you a storyteller who influenced the way that leader sees the world." What do storytellers do? According to Walt Disney, they instill hope again and again and again. Storytellers give us hope, and hope is a universal desire. I go along with that. Storytellers give hope. Storytellers inspire other people to be their best and to dream and have a vision for what, in our context, God can do in them and through them. I mean, think about it. Was Jesus a storyteller? I mean, was he much more than that? He certainly wasn't less than that. He was a storyteller. Matthew 13, verse 34. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in what? Parables. Parables, stories essentially. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So if Jesus thought that a story was a valuable part of every lesson, shouldn't you and I? How are you doing at telling stories effectively in your presentations? Now, Rob gives us three brief tips. I mean, we could say a lot about stories, but I'll just share with you the things he brings up in his book about stories, and you can see if they apply to you or are meaningful to you or what it might mean for you to incorporate these thoughts. So firstly, stories need detail. Stories need detail. They need enough detail to make them something we can connect with. Relevant detail is the watchword, not detail for its own sake. We probably all listened to someone tell a story which had all the details of the weather and the temperature and how that person was feeling, what they had for breakfast that day, which have no bearing on the substance of the story itself. One of the key things about storytelling is that you cut out much more than you leave in. And if you're writing a story, you have to throw so much away. And the same is true. If you look at the parables, try writing a parable like Jesus. Try keeping them as short and powerful as he did. It's really hard. I've tried myself. It's really difficult to write a parable like that. So you can see that it's important to have detail, but not too much detail. The detail we need is the detail that helps us to connect with the point of the story. So when Jesus mentions that the runaway son in the parable of the prodigal, when the runaway son ate the food of the pigs, when he mentions that, it would have resonated, of course, particularly with his Jewish audience, pigs being something they didn't eat or connect with or associate with in any way. So that detail would have been significant. It would have shocked them. Very helpful detail. When including your stories, when you're putting them into your presentation, your lesson, check to see that there is enough detail to make the story three-dimensional, but not so much that it engages our conversation in a confusing way. So we've got all this detail in our mind and we're missing the wood for the trees. So firstly, detail. Secondly, empathy. And these actually are very strongly linked. But empathy is a significant issue in telling an effective story or telling it effectively. So when telling a story, remember, its success largely depends upon creating empathy, that connection, that emotional connection, I suppose one could say. There's a film critic, I don't think he's with us any longer, but I've heard him referenced many times in terms of film reviews, a chap called Roger Ebert. And he said this, I think he said it several times in slightly different configurations of words, but I'll give you this quote, which I got from his website, talking about films. When films are effectively stories, obviously, most of them. He said, movies are the most powerful empathy machine in all the arts. Movies are the most powerful empathy machine in all the arts. More than painting, more than music, more than dance. The most powerful empathy machine. Why? Well, I can only speculate, but I would think partly, at least because they involve so many of the senses, orally, visually, the story, it engages in some powerful way. And I would hope that our sermons are not empathy machines, and the stories aren't empathy machines. We're not trying to machine something like manufacture it. But on the other hand, we must recognize that stories have that capacity to connect the point with the heart more than anything else. We've all watched films, haven't we, that have decent acting, a reasonable script, perhaps some competent photography. The cinematographer is excellent, and they've had a lot of really good elements, but those films have still been boring. And the films in which we fail to feel any connection with the actors, with the characters they're portraying, those films are rarely successful. If there's no empathy created, and just because you make a film doesn't mean you'll create the empathy, it's got to be something that's thought about. So I would challenge you, for example, to read the story of Lazarus in Luke 16 and not feel empathy. When you hear that story about Abraham, Lazarus, the rich man, I think we get that sense of empathy. And perhaps because we've read that story so many times, we might not quite get the same sense of empathy. But imagine if you were hearing it for the first time from Jesus and he told you about Lazarus and about the sores on his body and how he was carried to Abraham's side. You would feel a sense of connection, of empathy with Lazarus, I would think. So when preparing your stories to put into your lesson, ask yourself, are any of the characters in my story empathetic? Can they connect with the people I'm speaking to? Thirdly, application. Some stories need an application. Others are frankly so powerful that you can leave the Holy Spirit to have its effect on the hearts of those present without making a specific and direct application. So when considering the stories you're going to add to your presentation, ask yourself whether that particular story needs applying to your audience or not. Think about Jesus. I would say he varied his approach. Sometimes he gave an application and sometimes he didn't. Take, for example, the parable of the weeds in Matthew 13. After he told the parable without explaining it, his disciples came to him in Matthew 13:36. His disciples came to him and said, explain the parable of the weeds in the field. So he hadn't given an application. For some reason, that was the right thing to do, and he didn't give it. They came and asked, which shows that they'd been paying attention, and I guess that there'd been some kind of empathy created. They wanted to know what it was about. On the other hand, the parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18, very different. After he's finished telling that parable, that story, he says in Matthew 18:35, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you, unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. He tells the story and he says, this is what it means for you. This is how to apply it. This is why it's so significant. So it's a judgment call here. But as you think about the stories you're going to add to your lesson, then think about whether they're going to be applied or not. I finished my sermon for the Thames Valley Church last Sunday with a story about how a tree nearly fell on me 2 weeks ago and almost killed me. It was a very close thing. 10 seconds earlier, I'd been walking down the path and the tree fell. And if I'd been 10 seconds slower, I think I might be dead. I told the story. It didn't. I did apply that one. I applied it in the sense that I told them what I took from it, which was that I have an enemy and that my life matters. And perhaps we need to all think about that we have an enemy and our life matters. Sometimes you make an application, sometimes you don't. Right, wrapping up. How do you feel about telling stories? I think some of us feel we're natural storytellers and some feel that we're not, and we don't feel comfortable telling stories. I would say this, I wouldn't say it's impossible to teach a good lesson without telling a story. Of course it's possible. But I would suggest that if our model is Jesus, and he told stories all the time, that our lessons will benefit from learning how to tell stories well, at least to get better at it. Could that be one of your ambitions for 2021 for your speaking, to get better at telling stories? It seems to me like that might be a really good idea, a really healthy thing to do for you and for the people you speak to. Here's a question for you. Do you have a method for storing your stories? We tend to forget them. Things that happen to us, things we hear. You never know when you might need them. If you've got your own patented method for storing your stories, I would be very interested to know what that is. Now, I have recorded on stories before, so you'll find 3 other teaching tips on this topic if you want to check those out as well. The links are in the show notes. One of them is episode 96, how to reenact a story. One is episode 90, what is the difference between an anecdote and a story, both useful but not the same. And thirdly, episode 165, why you need keynote stories, which I enjoyed doing that one, I remember. So those 3 you may want to check out as well. If you've got any comments about today's topic, then please leave it wherever you hear or see this recording. You could email me as well, malcolm@malcolmcox.org, or you could leave a message on my website, malcolmcox.org. You can leave me a voicemail there, or you can also there, by the way, sign up for my newsletter. And if you do, I will send you a free ebook on spiritual disciplines called How God Grows His People. If you know anybody that might benefit from this, do pass the link on. Anybody that you think could do perhaps a better job telling stories, then pass it on in love. And I think that'll do for today. So between now and the next time we see each other, I do hope and pray that you have a terrific Tuesday and a wonderful week. Take care and God bless.